sick and hurting, those who are struggling right now. Be with them and place your hand on them, and just pray that you be with us as we go forward with this lesson. And Jonathan with his sermon, that he has a ready recollection of what he has to say, and that we pay attention, take something from that, apply it to our lives. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
want to welcome everyone here tonight, and we have some visitors with us tonight. We're so glad to have you with us, and welcome you back each and every time you have the opportunity to be here. So tonight you could say is my annual, seems to be like that now, my annual Isaiah 40 sermon. I have probably preached on this text more than any other, probably Old Testament text. Now, the one that beats it is 1 Corinthians 15 on the resurrection. I've probably preached on that one more, but this one in Isaiah 40. I've preached on it a few times here, and just wanted to come back to it again because it's such a great passage. In Isaiah 40, there in verse 31, there's a verse that's usually a standalone verse, and it's a great verse just by itself on its own. It's very encouraging. In Isaiah 40 and verse 31, it says, "But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Beautiful verse. The thing about that verse, and I heard a preacher a long time ago point this out, and it never got out of my head, that the verse, as good as it is, isn't even an entire sentence, really. It begins with "but." It's not even an entire thought. It has a context to it. And it's context that makes it even more beautiful, and it makes it even more meaningful for our lives. So tonight, we're going to give that verse context, this great verse context. Isaiah 40 is the beginning of a new section in the book of Isaiah. Chapter 39 of Isaiah ended with Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, getting the news that one day Babylon was going to come and plunder Jerusalem. And Hezekiah was worried that it would be in his day, but the Lord told him it wouldn't be in his day, so he was relieved. He says, "Well, fine, it's not in my day, so, that's good." But Babylon was going to come. Babylon, as we remember, was going to come to the southern kingdom of Judah, and they were going to plunder it. And the people were going to go through a horrid time. There would be 3 deportations to Babylon. And the third one, in about 586, 587, would end with the complete and utter destruction of Jerusalem. It was horrid. There's an entire book in the Bible called Lamentations, which talks about the aftermath of that horrid event and just how horrid it was for the people. And for Jeremiah himself, as he writes his book, and he writes about the destruction of Jerusalem, he witnessed it. But Isaiah lived long before that time, many years hence it would be before Jerusalem was destroyed. But Isaiah prophesies of that. But he writes, it's interesting that Isaiah, this is something about prophecy, that he writes about some of these events as though they've already happened, as though they've already taken place. Isaiah 53 is a lot like that. All of that main messianic psalm about Jesus, so many of the things said about Jesus is in the past tense. And I guess the reason for that is because our great God is not affected by time like we are, and he sees the beginning from the end, and he can write about it as though it's already happened. And that's how Isaiah 40 is. Isaiah 40 begins with the idea that Jerusalem's already been destroyed, and she's already received from the Lord her just due for all her sins. And what the passage in Isaiah 40, and really the rest of Isaiah, is about is to comfort that future generation of people that are going to be hauled off to Babylon, to a foreign country, and hear the news that their beloved city has been destroyed. They're going to be very discouraged. And so the main, I think, function of Isaiah 40 through 66 is to lift up those future generations, to give them a future hope. Not just for them to be restored back to their land. The main hope Isaiah actually gives is messianic hope, that their Messiah is one day going to come. And there's a lot of prophecies. There's so many prophecies in Isaiah 40 through 66 that are messianic, that are about Jesus. And I understand, I think some of you in maybe the high school or maybe the younger grades are going through Isaiah. I can't remember exactly which one it was. I think, Ryan, you're going through Isaiah. And you'll notice, if you haven't already been through that section, just how much is about Jesus. And so Isaiah 40 begins with some familiar passages that are prophesying of their coming Messiah. And this is to be a comfort, once again, to those who are going to face that horrid destruction of Jerusalem. He says in verse 1, chapter 40, first word, comfort. Comfort. Yes, comfort my people, says your God. Speak comfort to Jerusalem and cry out to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned, for she has received from the Lord's hands double for all her sins. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Maybe that's a familiar passage to us. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill be brought low. The crooked place shall be made straight, and rough places smooth. The glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. The voice said, cry out. And he said, what shall I cry? All flesh is grass, and its loveliness is like the flower of the field. The grass withers and the flower fades, because the breath of the Lord blows upon it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. And then in verse 9, there's an introduction to what really the main point of Isaiah 40 is. There's this herald of good news. And I dare say this is passages like this where that idea of the gospel comes from. A herald of good news. Verse 9, O Zion, you who bring good tidings, get up into the high mountains, O Jerusalem. You who bring good tidings, lift up your voice with strength. Lift it up, be not afraid. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God. And what follows from that statement are some of the greatest utterances ever said about the greatness of God. And Isaiah's point with this is to comfort God's people. To comfort those maybe in future generations who would go through hard times. But it's also been left to us to comfort us. Because here's how this passage is going to work. This passage is written specifically for people who are discouraged and believe that God has kind of forgotten them. Who feel like God is far away, that He's not answering them, that for some reason He's not hearing their voice. And we may all feel like that sometimes. So if you're in a place in life, maybe you're kind of like Job and you're wondering, where is God? And is He listening to me? And does He care? If there's thoughts like that that cross your mind, this passage was intended specifically for you. And we'll see how all of that works as we start in verse 10 and we read about the greatness of our God. Isaiah begins in talking about God's care. In verse 10, he says, behold, the Lord God shall come with a strong hand, and His arm shall rule for Him. Behold, His reward is with Him, and His work before Him. He will feed His flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs with His arms, and carry them in His bosom, and gently lead those who are with young. There's an interesting dynamic to me in verses 10 through 11. There's this language, He's coming. The Lord will come with a strong hand. Behold, His reward is with Him, and His work before Him. Usually in prophetic books like this, that ends up amounting to judgment language. How many passages like this say something like that and go on to talk about how God is going to come and judge? Well, there was a lot of that. There's a lot of that in Isaiah, in the earlier part of the book, and there's a lot of that in other prophetic passages, but here, when God comes, there's a softer message. There's a more encouraging message about what God is going to do coming with that reward. He is going to feed his flock. And this very tender picture of gathering the lambs in his arms and gently leading those here with young reminds me very much of Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want, in the things that God does to lead there. I think Isaiah's point with his verses is that before he goes on to talk about the greatness of God, he's going to utter some great statements about God's sovereignty and his greatness, about how he's far greater than anything we could possibly imagine. But before he gets to that, he wants us to understand his care. He does not want God's love and care for us to get swallowed up in his greatness. Some religions have believed that God is so great that he's almost detached from what he made, that he's removed himself, that he's so above us that he doesn't care about us. Well, God is great, and he is far above us, yet he cares so much for us. And as the Apostle Paul said in his great sermon in Acts chapter 17, he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live, we move, and have our very being. So Isaiah wants us to know, yes, God is great, but he cares. And God is great and he cares. Those two are not mutually exclusive things. God forbid they should never be. In verse 12, he begins with this view of God over all things. And he puts it in question form. He says, "Who has measured the waters and the hollow of his hand, measured the heaven with a span, and calculated the dust of the earth in a measure, weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance?" Well, we all know the answer to that question. As a little kid, we may have sung about God. He holds the whole wide world in his hands, and he does. Maybe we grow up, quote unquote, and we forget about that sometimes. His sovereignty over earth is so great. I mean, we sometimes get swallowed up in the vastness of our universe and just how large our own planet is. But God it's always weighed these things. And when he made these heavenly bodies and this earth that we call home, it was nothing to him to do that, to speak all of that into existence. He'll talk more about that later. Then he talks about the wisdom of God. And wisdom that nobody really has to teach him anything. He doesn't have a counselor and so forth like kings to tell him what to do. He says, verse 13, "Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or as his counselor has taught him? With whom did he take counsel? And who instructed him and taught him in the path of justice? Who taught him knowledge and showed him the way of understanding?" The answer to all of those questions is no one. No one. And that is one of the things that makes him God. That he is the source of all things. He is the source of wisdom. No one is his counselor, taught him. He's accountable to no one. Yet marvel that at the very same time as how wise God is and how knowledgeable God is, marvel at the fact that he listens attentively to the prayers of his people. And he listens to what they say. And he answers the prayers of those that call out to him. I mean, you hold both of those ideas together, and that'll give you something to think about for a very long time. In verse 15, he talks about his sovereignty over us. Sovereignty not just over us as individuals, but as nations. He says in verse 15, "Behold, the nations are as a drop in a bucket." I suppose that's where that phrase comes from. That's kind of a phrase I always heard growing up, and all my life, this is a drop in the bucket. And I read Isaiah 4, and I said, I bet that's where we get that. The nations, notice, are as a drop in the bucket. They're nothing to God, and are counted as small dust on the scales. Look, he lifts up the isles as a very little thing, and Lebanon is not sufficient to burn, nor its beasts sufficient for a burnt offering. All nations before him are as nothing, and they are counted by him less than nothing, and worthless. And as the proud king Nebuchadnezzar learned, he rules in the kingdoms of men. He does what he wishes with them. And in Isaiah 40, I think this particular message would have hit home with those future generations who are going to be in Babylon, that might read this and be encouraged by it, or future generations after that are going through some turmoil and they're being oppressed by some kind of nation, maybe their own nation, maybe another nation. It would be a peace and comfort to know that their great God, that nation that thinks they're so powerful, and these rulers that do all these things, they're the ones in control. They're not. They're not. It would be a great comfort for God's people to be reminded that the nations certainly are as a drop in the bucket. Now, of course, the people who acted like the heathens of old needed this next one. And we do too sometimes, because we're tempted to make idols out of things, not little statues maybe, but put things before God and belittle God in our minds. In verses 18 through 20, he talks then about God's greatness, his sovereignty compared to idols, and how foolish it was for the people of old to make these little idols out of wood and stone and gold and silver, and then bow down to it and worship it and act as if it made them. He says in verse 18, "To whom then will you liken God, or what likeness will you compare to him? The workman molds an image, the goldsmith overspreads it with gold, and the silversmith casts silver chains. Whoever is too impoverished for such a contribution chooses a tree that will not rot. He seeks for himself skillful workmen to prepare a carved image that will not totter." And can you liken God to any of those things? Absolutely not. One passage says, "Those who make them are like them, so are all of those who put their trust in these things." How foolish. God is so much greater than that. He's infinite. In fact, this picture of the greatness of God sort of ends with these great verses about God's sovereignty over the universe, and about how vast his creative capacity is, and how vast his care is, and his insight is to know intimately the creation that he has made. He says in verse 21, "Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in." My lovely wife just recently hung some new curtains in our house, and the windows and such, nice curtains. And you kind of get that image in your mind of God doing that with the entire universe. It's kind of an effortless thing. You stretch out the heavens like a curtain. Just amazing how he's putting it that way. Just stretches them out like a curtain, spreads them out like a tent to dwell in, like it's nothing. Verse 23, "Brings the princes to nothing. He makes the judges of the earth useless. Scarcely shall they be planted, scarcely shall they be sown, scarcely shall their stock take root in the earth, and he will also blow on them, and they will wither, and the whirlwind will take them away like stubble." And that's how rulers of the earth are. That's how all of the governments and so forth are. They don't last. The people in them don't last. They think they're strong, and they rise up, and they think they're powerful, but you just get this picture here. It's so cool. God just blows on them, and they go away. In verse 25, "To whom then will you liken me? Or to whom shall I be equal, says the Holy One?" And then verse 26, "Lift up your eyes on high, and see who created these things, who brings out their host by number. He calls them all by name, by the greatness of his might and the strength of his power. not one is missing. What's he talking about? Well, I believe he's talking about what you see when you go out on a starry night and you look up and you see the hosts of heaven. It's amazing how many stars are out there, how many hosts of heaven there are. There's just an infinitesimal amount that we can see with the naked eye. With telescopes, we can see much more. What's even more amazing is that in Genesis chapter 1, there's just a passing thought given to the creation of these things. It's like, He made the sun, the moon, and the stars, and it kind of makes a bigger deal out of them. And it says He made the stars also. That's all the attention that the stars get. He made the stars also. It's like, yeah, that's a thing to just mention on the side. This right here is one of my favorite photos of all time. I've showed it to y'all before. It's a picture that the Hubble telescope took quite a while back. So there was a spot in space that people have been looking at for a while before they had a telescope like this, and there wasn't anything there. They couldn't see anything there because they didn't have any instrument to peer out far enough. Well, they aimed the Hubble telescope in that little black dot to see if there was anything there, and whoosh, it's the image they got. If you think that the lights on this image here are stars, you'd be wrong. They're not stars. They're galaxies. Galaxies with their own billions and billions of stars. In past sermons, I have tried to represent them with a number, and I came up, I think, with the septillion is one of the biggest numbers that you could come up with, but really, no one knows how many stars are really out there. No one knows. It's so great. But notice what Isaiah is saying here about the greatness of God. Turn back to verse 26. He calls them all by name, and by the greatness of His might and the strength of His power, not one is missing. Calls them all by name? Yes. He calls them all by name, and by the greatness of His might and the strength of His power, not one is missing. There is not one star in this great universe that God has misplaced or wondered where He put it. He knows them all. He accounts for them all. And as Jesus said, He knows the very hairs of our head. They are all numbered. And so all of that leads up to the main application that He's making for those who are listening to this. And in light of everything He's just said, especially in light of that very last verse, because that's really the pinnacle of all of it. It's like, you got a name for every star. There's no other description of the greatness of God about His vastness anyway and His creative power that you could just talk about more than that. So in light of all of that, there's a question that He has for those who might be discouraged in their life, who might think that God has forgotten them, that He's far away, that He's not listening to them. He says in verse 27, "Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel? My way is hidden from the Lord, and my just claim is passed over by my God." In other words, somehow God's forgotten my case. Verse 28, he says, "Have you not known? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, neither faints nor is weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the weak, and to those who have no might He increases strength. Even the youth shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Now do you see the context of that great verse in verse 31? Isaiah is saying to anybody that thinks God has forgotten about them in their life, to remind them, do you not know the greatness of God and the greatness of His might and His understanding, how unsearchable it is? He doesn't faint. He doesn't get tired. He doesn't get weary. He says even the young men do that. I'll tell you, I just performed, Sam and Kim's wedding this past weekend. A lot of traveling, anything like that. It's really great. But I woke up this morning. I hit the snooze button a couple times, unashamedly. I was tired. Y'all, I'm in my 30s. I'm in my prime. A lot of people would consider the prime of life. I get tired some days. I get tired. We all get tired. Sometimes exhausted. God doesn't do that. God doesn't get tired. He doesn't need to sleep. He doesn't need to rest. His strength, it's always there. And He knows about our weaknesses. And He cares. And His message that He ends with is that if we're in need of strength in our life, if we're in need of spiritual strength, whatever it is that we need to get over that hump in our life, to get through the trials that are set before us, the promise is that if we wait on the Lord, the idea of waiting on the Lord in the Old Testament is the idea of placing our hope in Him and letting Him work things out in His time. That if we wait on the Lord, if we put our hope in Him, He will renew our strength. And He will get us through whatever it is. What a great message that Isaiah gives us about the greatness of our great God. And we'll leave it at that tonight. I hope that's been an encouragement to you that God's not forgotten you in your life, that He'll renew your strength if you wait for Him. And tonight, if you need encouragement in any way, maybe you need to put on Christ in baptism, or maybe you've done that, and maybe you need the prayers of the saints tonight. One of the ways that God strengthens us, He does it very many ways. One of the ways He does it through our brethren. In times like this, we come together and worship, we encourage each other, and if you need encouraging tonight, won't you come as we stand as we sing?